Hi everyone, I'm Aliyah from the United States, and I am here with another video in my book recommendation series. So today I'm telling you about the book Blood Over Bright Haven by M.L. Wang. This book came out in 2023, so it's fairly new, and it is a fantasy book. So I am reading this book, Blood Over Bright Haven, for a book club with my friends. We all were talking one day and decided that we wanted to share recommendations with each other, and we were having a hard time finding good books, especially fantasy. We were all fans of the fantasy genre, and so we sort of started this little book club to try to find some good books that were in this genre that were new. Many of the books that I've loved in the fantasy genre are a part of, really long series like Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire. There are other series out there that might be worth reading, and there are also some individual books out there that could be really cool. And so that's how we came across Blood Over Bright Haven. It is just a novel. It is not part of a series of books, so there's only one. And it's actually supposed to be in this genre called dark academia. Dark academia is sort of this genre or new aesthetic or style that I've been hearing about, and I quite like it. If you want to have an idea of what dark academia looks like, I'm going to use it as my background here. So you can see there's a school setting. You have this feeling of formality, dim lighting, dark colors, bookcases, books, formal wear, sort of moody, dark characters, dark personalities, dark characteristics in characters, things like that. If you also want another example of dark academia, you could take a look at some of the Harry Potter movies where you see that, the school is obviously taking place in a castle where there are things like parchment and quills and students wearing uniforms, dark clothing always, and a lot of, dark hallways and passageways and spooky things. So, but related to that school setting. So I thought that would be fun. So basically the premise of the book is there is a city called Tehran. It is a magical city. They have people who have magical abilities, and the main character, she wants to join sort of the highest level of professional magic. It starts off with her preparing to take an exam to get into that highest level of magic. And if she succeeds, she would be the first woman in the history of the city who achieved that, because there is discrimination against women in this story, and they are not allowed to progress in their careers. And the men in the story, have reserved magical powers as well as political powers for themselves. So she would definitely be breaking through and proving that, she's a good enough mage, is what she calls herself, a mage, someone who can perform magic. Let me get into some of the things that I liked about the book and some of the things that I didn't like about the book. I'm not going to share any spoilers about the story, but I want to tell you some things so that you can decide if you want to read it yourself. So let's get into the things that I liked. So first, I've always thought, performing magic was interesting and fun. I was a fan of Harry Potter growing up. Of course, I've kind of now grown out of that. And so it's interesting to find literature that is for adults that, still has some of those features. So I was excited that it was depicting performing magic, but in a way that was slightly different from Harry Potter. And, she doesn't use like a wand like they all do in that series. There's a different way to produce magic in this world that is pretty unique. So I like that a lot. The other thing that I like, and I generally like this, is a female protagonist. You know, for me, having a female main character usually means that I can relate to them. It's always kind of nice to read a story about someone that you identify with, right? And obviously, there are some feminist themes in the book, just knowing that she was being sort of kept out of this institution, and all of the women in this story are kept, pretty put down and repressed, and she's trying to prove that she's just as talented as and intelligent as anyone else, although that theme, of course, is explored in a lot of media. So you do have to be sort of careful that your story is bringing something unique to the table. And so, in that sense, I don't know if it quite accomplished that. Moving on, I want to talk about the setting of the book. The setting is just confined to this one city where the whole story takes place, and some of the surrounding areas. But this is not a fantasy story that has this big, humongous world, and there's many countries and many different geographies, and you have to look at maps to know where the characters are going and how far they're traveling. And it's not like that. This book has only one city, and you're only concerned with that one place. And so I thought that was quite refreshing for fantasy, because I think we have gotten used to the idea that fantasy stories have to take place in these big, complex universes that have a lot going on with them. It requires the author to do a lot of world building in their writing. They have to create this sense that this world is real, and they then have to provide a lot of details when their world is very huge. But in this case, the world is relatively small, still a lot of detail, but it keeps you focused on what the story is really about. This is the thing that I think is the most important thing about this book, is that it deals with some very serious topics, some very dark topics even, about humanity. It, in a way, is teaching us about real world issues. It's kind of a metaphor for things that have happened or are happening in the real world. And I'll give you an example. It deals with the exploitation of indigenous people and working class people, people of a different race, a racial minority, an oppressed minority. It deals with misogyny, of course, misogyny, the hatred of women, the oppression of women. And it also deals with white supremacy. In this case, it's the supremacy of men who can perform magic of a certain race, which is really a direct metaphor for white supremacy in our world, right? And what I appreciated about it is it wasn't so surface level. It actually went deep enough. It had enough intricacy to really show how some of those big, big issues show up in everyday life, in between relationships between people, which is why in a fictional story, these themes can be addressed in a way that resonates, right? You feel like that's a realistic, depiction of a conversation that a privileged person might have, knowing that they depend on the hard labor of another person who's considered inferior socially, but in the back of their mind really knows that they've exploited them, right? So there's something called cognitive dissonance. So this is a story that basically depicts that fictionally. And so if this is a topic that you're learning about, or you have a young person in your life who's kind of learning about this for the first time, this is a great way to introduce them to some of these more serious topics that we have to reckon with, as humanity. In that sense, I thought the book did a great job. There are some things that I didn't like about the book as well. I actually did not feel like it was dark academia. I didn't feel that it was dark enough in terms of the dialogue between the characters. So while the book addressed some dark themes, it did not really have a dialogue or a depiction of the setting, the scholarly sort of setting that a lot of the events take place in. I didn't feel it really described those places as dark per se. And the dialogue especially felt very immature. It did not match the level of seriousness, the stakes involved in the issues that the book deals with. But the dialogue between the characters felt very unsophisticated. They did not really sound like very emotionally intelligent people or like very complex people. So there was a bit of an issue there with the characters having enough depth, having enough complexity, and being developed enough. They were a bit flat. Meaning that the way that they behaved and talked was all very predictable and typical. It sounded very adolescent, if I can say. And so when I'm reading a book that is meant to be for adults, I don't want to feel like I'm reading a novel for young adults. Obviously, there's overlap in people who enjoy both genres, both teenagers and adults. But this was a case where I was expecting something more mature. The topics addressed in the book, the themes, were very mature, but the dialogue and the characters were not. I don't have anything against the idea that, a main character, a protagonist, doesn't need to be likable. I don't believe that they need to be likable, but I do think that the way that the author was positioning the main character was that she was supposed to be admirable. She was supposed to be relatable. So, I wasn't really happy with the character's immaturity. Here are some of my closing thoughts about who I think should read this book. I think people who like magic, first of all, should read this book. If you like fantasy and especially like stories that involve magic, you would like this. I think if you like female protagonists, you would like this. If you like books that deal with feminist issues, definitely. If you're someone interested in social justice issues, you would definitely like this. And I think that this is a book that is appropriate for both adults and teenagers to read. There was nothing, quote unquote, spicy. There was no content that was only for adults. I'll just put it that way. So with that being said, would I recommend this book as a form of comprehensible input via reading? I think that if you are at the level B2, you can try to read this book. There might be some things that are challenging, not in terms of the dialogue, but in terms of some of the terminology, because fantasy is a genre that is really well known for creating a lot of new names for places, for people, for types of people. There's a lot of inventing that fantasy authors do. And so for that reason, it can be harder to follow because you feel that there's a lot of information to remember. There tends to be a lot of names of people and places that you have to remember in fantasy. And so that might be one reason why this genre is difficult for learners of English who are exploring reading novels for the first time. I think B2 is a great level to start introducing that into your language learning as a form of comprehensible input through reading. But this one, I would say maybe give it a try. And if it's a little bit too difficult, no problem. Maybe go for something that is more young adult and come back to this later. I think that it's worth reading and could potentially be a good book for learners. And maybe that's a person that is somewhere between B2 and C1, I hope that that book review was helpful. I hope that I gave you enough information about the book without really going too much into the story and without any spoilers so that you can decide for yourself. Let me know in the comments, are you reading at all in your language journey? If not, that's okay. I'm just curious about how you guys are doing and how I can make more videos to support your learning. So take care. Bye.
If you want more videos like this, go to EnglishSponge.com. On the website, you can find videos from many different teachers. You can choose which level you want: A1 beginner, A2 beginner, B1 intermediate, or B2 upper intermediate. You can choose which accent you want to listen to: American, British, Australian, and also other accents. You can choose which topic you want to listen to, and you can choose which grammar point you want to focus on. The website will track your time, so you can see how many minutes you have listened to comprehensible input today, yesterday, and for the whole month. So go to EnglishSponge.com. The link is in the description of the video.